one of the two main pillars of my PhD research. In this part of my research, I'm exploring the potentials and implications of using transitional justice framework in the ongoing Kurdish conflict. To do so, I draw on the perspectives of those who have been involved in justice-seeking and peace-building efforts in Turkey. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. Just to give you a very brief context of where we are now in Turkey with regards to transitional justice, the armed conflict has been going on since 1984 between the state's armed forces and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK. There is a long history of denial and silence over conflict-related human rights violations, and transitional justice has never been adopted as an official framework. But transitional justice discourse was used a lot by victims of the conflict, lawyers, human rights advocates, and activists in their pursuit of truth and justice. In 2013, a peace process started, and it created a relatively peaceful environment. However, the peace process broke down in 2015 and the armed conflict escalated again. This was the beginning of one of the most violent periods of the armed conflict, characterized by curfews in Kurdish cities and towns. This period also paved the way for the deepening of authoritarian regime. So when we are talking about today's Turkey, this is the picture we have. We can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. I mentioned that transitional justice discourse was used by victims and activists. Their demands for justice resulted in a set of official and unofficial attempts that could be considered as transitional justice mechanisms. When we look at these attempts, what we see is, on the one hand, limited efforts for prosecutions and reparations, and on the other, unofficial transitional justice mechanisms initiated by civil society. I will only mention the two most concrete ones of the official attempts. The first one is the law on compensation for losses resulting from terrorism and the fight against terrorism, which was enacted in 2004. And the second one was a set of trials of former colonels for extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances in the 1990s in the Kurdish region. I also said that there were some civil society-led attempts. I think the most important one is the Truth and Justice Commission for the Diyarbakir prison. This commission was established in 2007 by a group of activists with the aim of collecting testimonies from ex-prisoners of the prison. The Diyarbakir prison is infamously known for the most severe human rights violations of the 1980 military coup period. This unofficial commission managed to collect testimonies from more than 500 prisoners, and their purpose was to pave the way for an official truth commission. And the picture that you see on the slides on the bottom is from one of the symposiums that the Commission held in Diyarbakir. Although the trials were a very important step in terms of publicly acknowledging the past crimes, impunity prevailed for the perpetrators of most violations. And in the photo on the top, you see the families and their lawyers waiting in front of the courthouse for one of these trials. It is important to note that these were all isolated individual attempts that were put in place in the absence of overarching agenda of dealing with the past. Human rights violations were detached from their political context, and the root causes of the conflict remained to be addressed. Given the failure of these attempts to bring about a fundamental political transformation, I find Thomas Hanson's categorization, transitional justice in the context of non-transitions in deeply conflict societies, as a useful analytical lens to look at Turkey from a transitional justice perspective. In the next two slides, I'll be sharing my initial findings based on the interviews I conducted last summer in Turkey with activists, lawyers, human rights advocates, and practitioners in order to understand the possibilities for implementing transitional justice in today's Turkey, where there is neither a peace process nor regime change in sight. Thank you. I'm going to start with the conceptions of transition and transitional justice among my participants. First of all, transition is understood as a dynamic terrain for political struggle. My participants consider transition as a non-linear, long-term process. They also think that transition is something that is fought for and initiated by people like them. Secondly, they perceive transitional justice as a useful toolkit and framework to deal with a wide range of human rights violations. It's also considered as a basis for thinking to tackle a broad social problem and bring about a sustainable resolution. I find this point particularly important since it shows that my participants are aware of the pitfalls of transitional justice, but they think they can still use what transitional justice has to offer to find solutions to conflict-related social and political problems. And finally, how they see transitional justice during conflict is kind of linking these conceptions of transition and transitional justice together, because they believe that transitional justice during conflict should be part of a broader struggle for transition to take place. And in relation to this point, taking action for transitional justice during conflict is seen as the responsibility of human rights advocates. I'd like to read a quote from one of my interviews, and this interview was with a lawyer slash researcher slash human rights advocate. She is also one of the founders of an NGO that is mainly working on dealing with the past and transitional justice. When I asked her about what they can do right now about transitional justice in the absence of a peace process, this was her response. Is there a ground for a truth commission now? No. But does it stop me from doing something to reveal the big picture for when such a mechanism is established? What could be the disadvantages of thinking about it when the conflict is still ongoing? Obviously, I know what my challenges are, but as a human rights advocate and lawyer, if I assume the responsibility of reminding the state of its role, what does prevent me from learning how to do it best? Can we move to the final slide? Thanks. I'd like to finish with the potentials and the limitations of using transitional justice in current situation in Turkey. In terms of the potentials, my participants think that the ongoing process could and should be used to do groundwork for the future peace process, so that the civil society will be prepared when the time comes for an official process. They see transitional justice as part of this groundwork. And there is a consensus among my participants that the peace process will start sooner or later, and the current efforts will have a cumulative effect. Every small step counts is an expression used by one of the participants, which I think reflects very well the common approach. I also asked them about what could be done right now in the absence of an institutional move towards transitional justice. There are several tasks that were highlighted by different participants. The most common of them is collecting data to use in later stages when official mechanisms are established. And the other main tasks are considered to be documentation of human rights abuses, data collection, analysis of the current situation through research, and doing memory work. I'll read another quote from the same interview. For instance, memorialization. It is a very important mechanism that was offered to me by Transitional Justice Framework, and there is no obstacle to do that. I do what I can do, I collect what I can collect. I can't force the government to apologize at the moment, but I can tell people what an official apology means. I can't create a new historical narrative, but I can discuss what it should look like. And finally, when it comes to the limitations to using transitional justice, the first thing is that it is not only the ongoing conflict or the absence of a peace process, but also the authoritarian regime that left little room for imagination and creativity in thinking about transitional justice. I'd like to read another quote here from another interview I had with a human rights advocate, academic, and medical doctor. She is currently the director of a human rights NGO which works with torture survivors, and she has been in the front lines of human rights activism in Turkey for so many years, and she was recently sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. And she says, "The biggest damage of this period is that we lost our ability to dream. Myself, for example, due to anxiety, I lost the ability to work and think deeply on something, and it will be very difficult to bring it back." Another limitation is again about the authoritarian regime, because the focus on transitional justice and peace is shifting towards other areas of human rights. There are always more pressing issues to be dealt with, such as the protection of human rights defenders. And finally, although there is consensus among my participants on the importance and value of implementing transitional justice during conflict, they usually refer it only as a preparation process, and they find it very unlikely to be implemented beyond a limited scope unless an official process is launched by